You're listening to A Second Look on The Orca. A second look is an opportunity for all of us to reflect on past events, unpack their significance, and discuss their long-term implications. A second look is intended to give thoughtful reflection on issues that made the headlines and elicited strong responses as a society. What did we think then? What do we think now? What have we learned? And now, your host, Justin Goodrich.
Welcome to this month's edition of A Second Look here on the orca.ca. I'm your host, Justin Goodrich. This month, we'll be taking a second look at the I Love J.K. Rowling's billboard controversy from September of 2020. For those who may not recall, the billboard made a brief yet highly controversial appearance in Vancouver last fall after the author, best known for her Harry Potter publications, made and stood by troubling remarks regarding gender identity. Erected on a busy part of Hastings Street, the billboard immediately drew the attention of Vancouver City Councillor Kirby-Yung, who called on Pattison Outdoor, the owner and operator of billboards throughout Metro Vancouver and beyond, to have the billboard removed. Today, I'm joined by Councillor Kirby-Yung to take a second look at that troubling event. Welcome to the program, Councillor.
Thanks for having me, Justin.
I'd like to start by asking you to share with our listeners the background behind this particular billboard. At first glance, it appears to be a benign, albeit bizarre billboard. However, when we put it in its proper context, the billboard has really nothing to do with expressing affection for a successful author, but rather diminishing persons from the transgender community. Unpack that for our listeners, if you could, please.
Sure. So that's a great question. And to set the stage, I'll say right up front, this billboard didn't have anything to do with love, just the fact that the individuals who purchased the billboard were in love with their position of sowing hate and division. And that really fundamentally is what it was about. So what happened, for those that aren't familiar, last September on a weekend, pandemic afternoon, actually started in the morning, and I saw a lot of commentary coming through on Twitter about this billboard that had been put up on Glen Drive in Vancouver. And it had a very simple message that said, "I love J.K. Rowling." And like you said, if you weren't particularly familiar, somebody might think, oh, we've got some Harry Potter fans here in the neighborhood, or, maybe there's a new, kind of book coming out and this is a teaser. But within the LGBTQ community, and specifically the trans community, it was well known that there were billboards like this popping up. And they'd happened in the UK, and then we've subsequently seen some down in the US. And they were brought forward by a movement that was really anti-trans community. And they were meant to stand in solidarity with J.K. Rowling, who had expressed some views that were generally denounced by the trans community.
So it's the weekend, it's early morning, sort of further set the stage, if you will. You're at home, you see these tweets and whatnot popping up. What kind of feelings did that elicit in you, and what were the steps that you took thereafter?
It was a really instinctive reaction for me, and it was a really visceral reaction, that it was clearly about hate. And when you hear from the individual gentleman that doesn't live in Vancouver, actually in one of the suburbs here in the Lower Mainland, who had purchased the billboards on his own, and went and looked at some of his social media, he had put out comments like, "Wow, we're really going to be stirring the pot here." Choosing my words carefully. I don't want to use some that I can't use on this podcast if it's family friendly. But he said, "We're going to be stirring, use your imagination and wait for what's coming," and kind of really setting the stage and teasing this out. So it was clear it was designed to elicit a reaction. And so when I saw it, it was really obvious to me, and I just instinctively fired off a sort of comment on social media denouncing it, and expressing that this was really stood on the side of hate. And while it might not be actually legally classified as hate speech, it was really designed to be hateful. And I called on Pattison Outdoor, who was the outdoor company, to have the sign removed and taken down.
Well, Councillor, there's that old saying: if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's a duck. And I think in its proper context, that billboard, it's very clear between the billboard itself and the commentary by the individual who paid to have this thing erected, that there was an alternative agenda. So you call on Patterson Outdoor. They're quite prompt. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think within a day or so they had it covered up, and then another day or so later completely removed. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was actually moved with lightning speed. It was down by the afternoon, so within a matter of hours. And so, full credit and full props to them. But also, I think shout out to the whole LGBT community of Vancouver who rallied. And it was a storm on social media that just took off of everybody jumping on board. And it was nice to see an outpouring of love to counter the amount of hate there. Although I have received a lot of hate myself for having taken that action. But really, I think people stood up and had a voice and just called it out for what it was.
Well, as a member of that of the LGBTQ2 community, I I quite literally, it was a Saturday, and I quite literally slept through the whole thing. By the time I got to my social media account, dozens, if not hundreds, of people raising their voices. Now, you alluded to this a second ago, so I want to talk about that reaction that you received specifically. So, in looking back at your Twitter account from that day and the days following, you had 449 comments relating to your original tweet. Now, while some, as you rightly point out, were supportive, many were incredibly harsh. Some alleged that you were infringing on free speech. Others alleged you were being anti-feminist. Others stated that you were overstepping your authority and acting outside of your jurisdiction as a city councillor. And on top of all that, there were calls by some for resignation, which just blows my mind. I don't know what these people are thinking. But when reading those tweets, what were you thinking, and how did those tweets impact you?
It's a really good question, and you said a lot there, so let's unpack that a little bit and break it down. So yes, I'm human and I have a personal reaction to it, and it's not great when you're sitting there and you're just getting a barrage of hateful, vitriolic, negative comments, like you said, that really are attacking you as a person. They're attacking the job that you've chosen to do. You stood up for public service in the city, and so that doesn't come without sort of that you get a little bit of that human reaction, but you kind of have to learn in this job to put that aside, and remember why you're doing it in the first place. So that's the first thing. The other thing that it really said to me is that if I got that kind of reaction and that kind of vitriol and hate just for standing up and calling this out, what is it like for members of the trans community that receive that every day? So
Sure.
from my perspective, that sort of made it really reinforced for me why we have to stand up and we have to speak out when we see these situations, and have a voice, or try to give other people a voice that where theirs is is not heard.
Well, and you make some excellent points there as well. Certainly, certainly this whole thing is quite distressing, because if we put it in a much broader context in terms of what seems to be going on here in Vancouver, things only seem to be getting worse. We're not only seeing it in the LGBTQ2 community, but we are seeing it in the Asian community and in the Jewish community. Share with listeners some of the things that are happening here in Vancouver along those lines that concern you as a city councillor.
So I mean, you touched on some of them. So let's go back a little bit in time, because I actually did a bunch of research on this, and I brought forward a motion for an anti-hate strategy in the city of Vancouver, and I did that sort of heading into last summer when we were in the first part of the pandemic. And when we saw the alarming increase in anti-Asian hate crime, up more than 800% year over year, and targets against people because they were characterizing COVID as the China virus, told people to go home. You saw seniors attacked on the streets, Indigenous people that were mistaken for people of Asian heritage, that were also attacked. I mean, it was pretty horrific and becoming pretty sad. But this wasn't an isolated incident. We had incidents of homophobic preaching down in Vancouver's West End, which really put that community on edge, because that was sort of a very clear, albeit under the guise of freedom of expression, but clear denouncement of an entire group of people. And then if you look back, our Jewish community has continued to suffer incidents of anti-Semitism. We have seen swastikas imprinted in front of homes where people know that Jewish residents live there when there's been roadworks or new sidewalks have been poured. And if you look at StatsCan's annual data, Vancouver in 2019 actually became the city in all of Canada that had the highest incidence of hate crime per capita. Think about that.
Well, I mean, as you, I mean, you and I have had these conversations for a while, and I've given much thought to it, and it's incredibly disheartening. And for a city that's supposed to be so incredibly progressive, to know that there are these pockets of hatred, really heartbreaking. Now, you mentioned, Councillor, that you had put a motion forward. As I understand it, that motion was not, however, ratified by the majority of your colleagues. Now, it seems to me the duty of an elected official, certainly at the municipal level, among other things, is to ensure that core services are being delivered in a fiscally responsible fashion, while simultaneously setting the tone for the kinds of values our city ought to represent. So I'm curious, in your opinion, why was that motion not ratified by the majority of your council colleagues?
It's one of the biggest disappointments that I've had, and I honestly would say it's, I think, one of the biggest failings of this council so far to step up and take action. What they did, for those that don't understand the lingo and the processes, is that we didn't actually get to a vote. What they did is they referred it to staff for further review and consultation. And that's a nice way oftentimes of burying a motion, right? Delaying something, having it take a bunch more time, putting it in the hopper, so to speak, and it takes a long time before it comes back. There was a lot going on at that time when I submitted the motion and originally put it in. We saw the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes. We then subsequently, as council got to that discussion, saw sort of the emergence of the BLM movement and a lot of public dialogue around that. And as we've talked, ongoing kind of racism and discrimination against a number of different groups. So to me, it was quite clear that we needed a broad-based anti-hate strategy for the city, because when one group is targeted, it never stops and ends with one group. It impacts a number of individuals. I think that there was a lot of dialogue getting into whose voices were needed to be prominent at that point in time, with all of the different communities that were being affected. And I think that sidelined council, honestly, from the bigger picture around, are we as a council taking the right leadership to establish a kind of a safe environment for everybody in Vancouver?
Well, I'm certainly, as a resident of Vancouver, also so much disappointed by the fact that this wasn't ratified. I think setting the tone is key for elected officials. So let's piece all of this together then. So we've talked about the Heart J.K. Rowlings, and we've talked about the time thereafter and what happened on social media and the visceral that came from that. Then you try and take this initiative designed to sort of unite council and unite the city through the lens of a shared set of values. It doesn't happen. Here we are, we're taking a second look all these months later. My question to you is, with all that context, what, if anything, would you do differently? And do you have any regrets?
I don't have regrets. I will never regret standing up for a group that has experienced hate or been the target of hate. I would regret not doing that. So that's pretty clear for me. I don't have to spend a lot of time kind of revisiting that one. You do your best with a very diverse council and a number of political views to try to bring everybody on board. And I think there's always more to be done there. I do think that we'll have a chance to have a second look at that motion at council. I think the city will come back. You like that? A little pun in there for you?
That was
Second,
good. A second look.
second look. I think the staff will come back with sort of a broader based anti-hate strategy because there's a clearly demonstrated need for it. We're not seeing those issues diminish in the city. If anything, we're seeing them grow. So it's just taking longer than I think it needed to take. But sometimes that's part of the process, right? Is that you need to continue pushing some of those challenging issues uphill. And sometimes it takes a little bit longer to get where you need to go, but that doesn't mean that you stop doing it.
No, of course, of course. Let's do something different rather than take a second look. Let's take a moment and look ahead. What is
Is that going to be, maybe that'll be a spin-off podcast?
that could be you should host it. It would be fantastic.
I could do that. I could do that. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Let's take a look ahead and ask ourselves, or my question for you is, looking ahead 6-12 months from now, where are we at with some of these issues? Is it realistic that by then staff will have come back? Just give us a sense of if there's any optimism or pessimism, or what's the future going to hold for us as best as, without a crystal ball. What do you think?
Okay, well, without my crystal ball, but a little bit of council perspective. A couple of years under my belt now, we're about halfway through the term. I do think that we'll start to see some of this work coming back. I think that some of this work is going to take some time, and again, it should, right? Because it's not like you deliver a strategy and it's finished. This is something that should be part of the ethos and part of our ongoing. It should be built into our DNA, and it should be part of our ongoing efforts. But yeah, some of the work has slowed down, particularly in terms of social equity with the pandemic, because naturally our staff have been on the ground, and a lot of those same groups that are tasked with doing this kind of work have also been on the frontline delivery in terms of pandemic response as well in all of our community services. So I think we'll get something back, and I think that we'll need to keep pushing this forward and make sure that it's not waiting to a specific group, but that all of our diverse and different communities can see themselves in it. That's what I'm hoping for in terms of a look ahead for what I want to see. But I'm pretty realistic. It's going to take some work to get there, and you can't kind of rest and assume it's going to turn out the way that you want to. If I've learned anything in my 2 years at City Hall, I've learned that.
Well, it's great to cast a vision for what could be, and obviously we're all hoping that the work that's being done will ultimately take us there. In the meantime, if you were to give one piece of advice to Vancouverites on what they can do to help mitigate some of the hatred, be it the trans community, the Jewish community, the Asian community, and any community that is not only marginalized but seems to be there seems to be an escalation in all of this hatred. What do you say to the residents of Vancouver in terms of what they can do to play a role in helping combat this trend?
Great question. I think a couple things. The first one is, at the end of the day, we're all people, and everybody's got pretty similar hopes and desires in life. And so if you see somebody that is subject to hate and that kind of vitriol, first thing I do is say, speak up, show support, show solidarity. That's huge. It goes a long way, and hopefully drowns out those counter voices. So that's really, really important. Communities need to know that others are standing with them. And then I think the other thing practically is, when we're investing in these types of things as a city, is to demonstrate it really is a problem. So if you are a victim of a hate crime, or if you see a hate crime, is be a good witness. So try to pay attention to what's happening, report it, the hate crime, so that the stats are there and we can justify a lot of this work. And it's not something that the City Canada should do on its own. The province has stepped up and made a number of commitments in this area and is willing to continue to sort of move this forward. The government of Canada did when it launched an entire, kind of strategy federally. So I think that there's a real opportunity here, but we need to continue documenting the problem, and hate can't stay hidden. Hate has to be called out.
Well, Councillor, I think those are some fantastic sentiments, and I just want to, before we close, take an opportunity to just commend you for having the courage to lend your voice to the Heart J.K. Rowling's issue and all the other issues that involve people being mistreated. To be their champion, to be vocal, and to endure some of the vitriol as a result, particularly on social media. it takes courage and it takes resiliency, and clearly you have both. So as a citizen of Vancouver, my thanks to you for raising your voice.
Thanks, Justin. I appreciate it. I'm also on the first 80% female council, so we should talk about that sometime too. What that's like being a female politician and the opinions that people throw your way because of that.
You know what? I can't even imagine, and I'm always willing to have a conversation with you about things that matter. So we'll do it one of these days. We will do it.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me on A Second Look.
Well, that brings us to the end of this edition of A Second Look here on the orca.ca. I'd like to thank my guest, Councillor Sarah Kirby-Yung of the City of Vancouver, for joining me to take a second look at an event that reminds us all the only way to tackle injustice and promote equality is for all of us to raise our voices. Until next time, I'm Justin Goodrich. Thanks for listening.
The preceding program was brought to you by Alliance Public Affairs Group in association with Van Grio. If you have any questions or comments about today's episode, please email us at asecondlook@theorca.ca. Thank you for listening, and please remember to like and share.